Is anyone out there?
What if I told you an old man, living alone in the Wyoming mountains, risking his life to save a wounded Bigfoot? Not because he believed in myths, but because the creature's eyes reminded him of the daughter he lost. Contrary to what most believe, this Bigfoot wasn't violent. It was scared, injured, and later, it protected the very man who saved it. One stormy night, it even dove into a raging flood to rescue one of the hunters who once trapped it. This isn't a fairy tale. It's based on a hidden account from the town of Dubois, known only to a few locals who still whisper about it. By the end of this video, you'll see why some wild secrets deserve to stay hidden, and how an old carpenter and a grieving widow became guardians of something sacred. Harlan Vick, 68, lost his family, vanished into the woods for decades. But when he pulled a Bigfoot mother and her child from a steel trap, something inside him awakened again. Skip this story, and you'll miss what might be the most quietly powerful encounter ever recorded. A reminder that sometimes silence and compassion are the only protection the wild has left. The last snow hadn't melted completely in the high folds of Absaroka. Between streaks of stubborn white, icy water ran over rock, clear as glass, tumbling into dark hollows that hadn't seen sunlight since last September. Pine needles slick with melt clung to Harlan Vick's boots as he moved through the thinning forest. The sky above him spat little bits of leftover hail, sharp, momentary things that tapped on his flannel like someone trying to get his attention but didn't really mean it. He stopped on the slope behind the cabin, looking back. Smoke curled steady from the stovepipe. That old thing had outlived 2 presidents and 1 family. A weathered cabin crouched into the hillside, built by his hands and now maintained by them, piece by piece, one splinter at a time. Every crack in the wood had a story. Most of them he wished he could forget. Harlan's hands, rough, veined, thick-knuckled from decades of hammer and chisel, tightened slightly around the bundle of split pine he carried. He dropped the stack near the chopping stump, wiped his brow with the edge of his coat sleeve. Somewhere downhill, water surged under the footbridge, swollen from thaw. The season was restless. He could feel it in his bones. He didn't talk much anymore, not even to himself. Words were something you used when you believed someone was listening. It had been years since that applied. He fished the creek, carved spoons from chokecherry, patched the roof when the wind clawed at it. Each task was its own prayer, quiet, repetitive, incomplete. Grief liked it that way. Late that afternoon, the sky darkened fast. He heard it before he saw it. A sound that didn't belong to any bird, elk, or coyote. It was an animal. Not exactly. It was thin, wet, like a child's cry. Except it lingered too long, twisted at the end like something holding back a sob. He froze, waited. Nothing. Then it came again. He dropped the kettle, grabbed his coat, and followed the sound down the ridge, past the narrow game trail that deer used and tourists didn't know about. Pine boughs whipped against his jacket. Rain had started now, cold, sparse, but insistent. His boots sank slightly in the moss, darkening with each step. The cry came again, closer this time, broken up by something like shivering. His breath quickened. Not fear, not yet, but something older. The kind of tension a man carried in the back of his ribs when he knew he was about to see something that might not let him be the same afterward. A clearing opened up just past a clump of brush. There, tucked into the base of an uprooted tree, was something. At first, it looked like a heap of fur caught on a root, soaked and trembling. But then it moved, slow and low, clutching the twisted ruts of bark with long fingers. Not paws, fingers, 5 of them. Harlan crouched low, not stepping closer yet. The creature was small, 3, maybe 4 feet tall, but its proportions were wrong. Too long in the arm, too thick in the shoulder. Its fur clung to it like a drowned coat, black and slick, matted with mud. It looked up, eyes the size of silver dollars. No whites, just deep amber glass. And in those eyes was something he hadn't seen in decades, something he'd forgotten how to name. It wasn't wildness. It was something closer to recognition, maybe even pleading. The creature, no, the child, tucked into itself, one arm bent awkwardly as if hurt, the other gripping a root like it was the only thing keeping it in this world. Its lips, if they were lips, trembled, and a low hum came out. Not a growl, not a whimper, just a hum, like it was trying not to cry anymore. Harlan's stomach flipped, just like that. In that one sound, in that one look, he was not on the mountain anymore. He was in that hospital hallway, 15 years back. A gurney, a sheet, a single boot falling off the end, and nothing to say to his wife's crushed hand except, "I should have been there." His boots shifted against the wet moss. He took one step forward. The creature flinched but didn't run. Behind it, he spotted the signs. Splayed branches snapped at 7 feet high, drag marks in the earth, slick with blood and gravel, a smear that trailed back into the tree line. He followed it with his eyes but didn't move. A second trail ran alongside it. Not a drag, more like slipping, stumbling, then disappearing into the ferns. He looked back down. It was still watching him. Not blinking, not breathing hard, just waiting. Harlan bent slowly, knees cracking. He placed one hand in the dirt, then the other. Made himself small. Let the rain hit his neck. Let the world get quiet. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He reached out, palm up. No words, just the hand, just the moment. It was all he had, all he could give. And for a long second, nothing happened. Then, fingers, smaller than his, but still too large to be human, brushed his calloused skin, clung to it, and didn't let go. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled over the mountains. The trees bent with the weight of wind and memory. And down on that muddy forest floor, something ancient and broken opened its eyes for the second time that day. But this time, it wasn't alone. The rain kept falling. The trees said nothing, but the silence around them had changed. It was no longer the silence of grief, but the silence of a promise not yet spoken. Harlan didn't know what this was, what it meant, or where it would take him. But he knew one thing with a certainty only age can provide. He couldn't walk away. Not again, not this time. He stood up slowly, lifting the creature in both arms. It was heavier than he expected, solid, dense with muscle. But it didn't resist. It curled into him like a soaked blanket, breath warm against his chest. The walk back to the cabin was long. The path was slipperier now. Each branch he brushed against seemed to whisper doubt. But he kept going, past the wood pile, past the door he hadn't opened for anyone in over a decade. Inside, the fire had gone out. He laid the creature near the stove, wrapped it in an old quilt. He didn't light a lamp, just sat beside it in the half-light, hand resting near its strange, matted fur. Outside, the wind howled down from the ridge, carrying scents of pine, blood, and something he couldn't quite name. He didn't sleep, not that night. Not really. He just watched the shape beside the hearth, breathing, alive. And somewhere, not far off, another shape limped through the dark, massive, wounded, disappearing into the forest with every step, dragging silence behind it. The forest held its breath, and Harlan, for the first time in years, forgot how to exhale. The sky burned hard and blue that morning, clear as polished glass. Heat pressed against the ridges above Whiskey Basin, curling the pine needles, waking the sap. Summer had come fast this year, without apology. Down in the folds between the ridgelines, the trees stood still and tense, as if they too were holding their breath. High above it all, the fire tower waited like a nail driven into the hilltop, silent, sunstruck, and watching. Ruth Calhoun stood alone in the small metal cage at the top of the tower, one hand on the binoculars, the other clutching a chipped thermos that hadn't held coffee in 3 hours. Her flannel stuck to her back where sweat met the harness strap. She squinted westward, scanning the slopes above Dubois. Nothing, no smoke, no shimmer, no movement. But the feeling was there, that unplaceable weight behind her eyes. The kind that didn't come from the sun or the altitude. The kind she'd learned not to ignore. Ruth had known silence most of her life. Real silence. Not the kind city folks talked about when they turned off their phones, but the kind that came when you buried your husband without ever getting to say goodbye. She carried that kind with her up here, into the treetops, into the fire tower, into the long stretches of June where the only sounds were wind and the distant groan of eagles overhead. She liked it that way mostly. It kept the edges smooth, kept the ghosts quiet. But that morning, the silence had a hum in it. She couldn't say why, just that it itched at her nerves and made her scan twice in every direction. Around noon, she descended the stairs, boots heavy on metal rungs, and set off toward the lower trail, telling herself she was just stretching her legs, that she wasn't really following anything, that her hand didn't tremble slightly on the grip of her walking stick. The path she took ran close to Torrey Creek, cutting past the undergrowth where the deer trails braided into the thick. The air smelled like hot stone and pine tar. Her breath came steady, but her eyes moved like something was already waiting to be seen. And then it was there. Harlan Vick, hunched over something in the dirt. His frame still tall, still strong, but slouched now, drawn tight like rope that had weathered too many storms. His clothes looked heavier than they should. He didn't notice her at first, not until she stepped on a dry stick and he turned his head fast, like a man who hadn't slept well. Their eyes met, just for a beat, and she saw it. That same feeling she'd been carrying all morning, except deeper, quieter, older. He looked like a man who'd seen a thing he couldn't forget. She approached slow, careful. Not out of fear. Ruth had faced worse than backwoods tension. It was respect. Harlan didn't speak, just shifted his weight and let her see what he'd been kneeling over. The ground was torn up. Roots ripped, saplings bent flat, a patch of moss stained dark red. Blood, thick, fresh. Too much to be deer, too heavy to be cougar. And beside it, dragging deep through the soil, a trail that ended at the edge of a boulder. But it wasn't the blood that made her breath catch. It was the hair, long, black, threaded into the brambles like something had clawed its way forward. Not coarse like bear, finer, straighter. She crouched, picked one up, held it against the sun. Her fingers twitched. She looked back at Harlan. He said nothing, just nodded once. And that was enough. The trail led them deeper, down through old fire scars and wind-felled logs, through patches where the sun broke and shimmered off bark like wet glass. And then came the sound. Not an animal cry, not human either. It was a breath, a low, rasping breath, like a lung that had been crushed and was fighting to stay open. They rounded a bend and saw it, trapped. A massive figure lay crumpled near a snare. A steel-jawed thing meant for something far smaller. Its leg caught clean through the calf, bone possibly broken, the metal biting in through thick layers of fur and skin. Blood soaked the earth beneath it. The creature had fallen on its side, one arm draped limp, the other twitching in response to pain. And its face, God, its face, was turned toward them. Eyes half-lidded but aware, watching. Ruth's chest tightened. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her knees bent on instinct, slowly bringing her level with it. It didn't bare teeth, didn't lunge, just stared. Behind her, Harlan shifted, pulling something from his bag, a length of rope, a wooden wedge. She moved to help without a word. They both knew. This thing, it wasn't an it. It was a someone. And it had been waiting. A rustle behind them made them turn. And then another figure burst through the brush, smaller, wet, caked in mud. Its eyes wide with terror, its limbs shaking so hard it nearly fell. The little one. The one Harlan had brought in. It cried out, high and broken, and stumbled forward, collapsing against the larger form's side. The mother. The child clung to her leg, wrapping tiny fingers, if you could call them that, around the injured part. The mother let out a low sound, a hum, like a response, like comfort, like goodbye. They worked fast. Harlan drove the wedge into the hinge of the trap, sweat rolling down the sides of his face, teeth gritted. Ruth looped the rope around the opposite arm, threading it through a notch she carved into a thick branch. Together they pulled. The trap groaned, resisted, then creaked open. A snap of tension released like a sigh. The mother jerked her leg free, moaning low. Ruth dropped to her knees, hands shaking as she tore off strips of cloth and wrapped them around the wound. Harlan used water from his canteen to clean the dirt and blood, eyes never leaving the creature's face. Not once did it try to strike them. Not once did it scream. It just watched, like it understood. Ruth leaned close, whispering. The words weren't for Harlan. They weren't even for herself. They were for something else, something sacred. If we're gonna save her, she said, we have to bring her back to the woods. Harlan didn't speak. He just nodded, jaw tight, eyes locked. The child whimpered. The mother leaned her head back against the rock. Her breathing was shallow now, labored. Ruth moved to support her, but the weight was too much. Harlan slid an arm beneath her shoulder, lifted gently, muscles straining, face pale with effort. They didn't ask each other how or why. They just did it. By the time they reached the clearing near Harlan's cabin, the sun had fallen below the tree line. Long shadows stretched across the path. The light hit the mother's face in bands, gold and black, gold and black. Her eyes fluttered, closed, then opened again. The child kept one hand wrapped in the fabric Ruth had tied around its mother's leg, never letting go. They eased her down near the same outbuilding where Harlan stored his lumber. She slumped against the wall, eyes glassy. Ruth crouched beside her, one hand on the creature's wrist. The pulse was faint. Still there, just barely. A gust of wind swept down from the ridges and brought with it the smell of rain. The kind that came fast and loud. The kind that erased tracks. The sky was readying for something. They both knew it. But for now, in that moment, it was quiet. Too quiet. And then they heard it. Not from the trees, from the edge of the clearing. The forest didn't make sounds like that on its own. Not that deep crunch. Not that deliberate hush. Harlan turned, scanning the edge, and there, buried half in shadow, was a footprint. But not one that belonged to the creatures. It was booted, fresh, and beside it, something small, almost missed. A cartridge casing, dropped right at the edge of the trail. He picked it up slowly, the metal still warm from the day's sun. The mother stirred. The child curled into her side. Ruth's hand found Harlan's arm, gripped it tight. They both knew. They weren't alone. Not anymore. And whatever was watching had been for longer than they realized. The first crack of thunder rolled in low, like a faraway growl from something big and ancient shifting beneath the earth. By the time Harlan latched the door behind them, the rain had started in earnest, falling hard and slanted against the cabin roof, beating like 1,000 small fists. The air inside the structure was cool and damp, smelled of cedar and ash. In the corner of the room, near the back wall where he'd kept his old tool rack, he'd cleared a space, threw down thick burlap and a pair of wool blankets from the war chest his wife had never opened after the funeral. That was where the mother now lay, her long limbs folded unevenly, head against the beam. Her breathing was uneven, but steady, loud in the stillness. Beside her, curled into her side, the little one barely moved except to adjust closer when the thunder growled again. It hadn't cried since the forest. It didn't need to. The sound of the storm did it for them. Ruth knelt near the cast-iron stove, hands moving with the certainty of an old habit. The flame inside hadn't caught yet. The kindling was damp from this morning's walk. She didn't rush, just worked. One match, then another, until finally a thread of flame took hold and spread like memory. The warmth came slowly, and the light cast itself onto the faces in the room, human and otherwise. No one spoke. Harlan was at the bench, unrolling a strip of fabric he'd torn from one of his old shirts. The mother's leg looked worse now under the light. The bleeding had slowed, but the wound around the shin was deep and discolored. He'd cleaned it twice already with what little he had. Boiled pine needles, crushed comfrey root, but infection didn't care for good intentions. He pressed a fresh poultice into the wound and bound it tight, knuckles white from the tension. Behind him, the little one watched everything. Didn't blink much, didn't speak. Just followed every movement, eyes darting from Harlan's hands to the cloth to his face and back again. Then, slowly, it inched forward. Not cautious like a stray, not terrified like a child. More like curious. The way a crow might inch toward something glittering. It reached out, small fingers wrapped in dark fur, and touched the back of Harlan's hand. He froze. The touch wasn't strong, barely pressure at all, just presence. But it went through him like a flood. Not fear. Something heavier, sadder. That little hand. It reminded him too much of another small hand he hadn't held long enough. A hand that slipped from his own when she was just 7. One moment climbing up the scaffolding to give her daddy lunch. The next, the boards gave way. He hadn't even turned around in time to catch her. He closed his eyes for half a second and let the warmth of the fire settle into his spine. Then he opened them and looked down. The creature, no, the child, was still holding on. He didn't move, didn't speak, just let it stay there. Outside, the rain shifted directions, beat harder on the back windows, shook the tin roof like a warning. Ruth ladled out a bowl of oatmeal she'd made from what little they had left, stirred in some wild berries from the pantry, the ones Harlan never touched but she refused to throw away. Then she added a spoonful of honey, thick and amber. The smell lifted, soft and sweet. She brought the bowl over, crouched near the child. It backed away at first, huddling under its mother's side. But Ruth waited, didn't speak, didn't coax, just held the bowl low, steady. Eventually, 2 wide eyes peeked out, then a nose, then the full form. It reached out, touched the spoon, dipped 2 fingers into the warm mixture and sniffed. Then, delicately, licked them clean. Ruth smiled, just a little. Her knees cracked as she stood. "It's not much," she muttered, mostly to herself. "But it's a start." The storm deepened as the afternoon wore down. By dusk, the trees outside had vanished behind sheets of rain. Every now and then, lightning would split the sky, and the whole cabin lit up like a photograph. Harlan placed 2 fresh logs in the stove. Ruth fetched another blanket from the back room, and the creatures slept, or tried to. Harlan sat near the window after sundown, staring out into the dark. The woods were alive with noise, the creak of limbs, the rush of water in swollen streams, the occasional crack of something heavy falling where it shouldn't. But none of that was what held his attention. It was the silence between the sounds. The rhythm was off. Too much movement out there for a storm. Too calculated. Too quiet when it shouldn't be. He stood and pulled on his coat, grabbed the lantern. Ruth met his eyes across the room. You feel it too? She asked. He nodded. Let me get my boots. No, stay with them, he said. Voice low, firm. She didn't argue. The rain soaked him the moment he stepped out. Wind slammed the cabin door behind him, hard enough to rattle the glass. He walked slowly, scanning the ground around the porch. Nothing. Not yet. Then he saw it. A splintered twig. Barely broken. Too clean, not natural. A few steps further near the shed, the earth was disturbed. Just slightly. A partial print in the mud. Deep heel, narrow toe. Boots, human, but wide set, like someone squatting low. Waiting. Then his lantern flickered and he caught a glint of white. Up the tree. Chalk. Someone had marked the bark. A circle with a line through it. Faint, but there. A hunter's symbol. He followed the markings along the edge of the clearing. At the far end, near where the trail curved toward the eastern ridge, his boot caught something in the dirt. Metal. He bent down, wiped the mud away. A bullet casing. Clean, dry, recent. He looked up at the trees. Nothing. No movement. But his skin crawled, the way it had when they'd lowered the casket, when the priest said words that didn't matter, and the wind had shifted just enough for Harlan to smell sawdust, as if the world was reminding him of where she died and what he hadn't done. He went back inside, soaked, silent. Ruth looked up from her seat beside the fire. She didn't need to ask. His face told her more than words could. They weren't alone. He hung the coat, sat down. The mother stirred in her sleep, groaned. The child shifted, whimpered once, then settled again. The fire cracked. A knot popped. Ruth reached for the Bible she kept folded under her coat, but didn't open it. She just laid her palm on it, like someone might with a photograph of a face they couldn't forget. She began to whisper. Just a verse, not a sermon, not a plea. Something soft, meant for her, not for them. And across the room, Harlan closed his eyes. The sound of the rain deepened. The wind screamed once across the roof, then fell silent. But that night no one really slept. Not all the way. Not with the scent of metal still in the air. And not with someone out there, waiting. The heat hadn't broken in days. By late August, the sun scorched through the branches with the sharpness of a blade, slicing shadows into hard-edged shapes across the clearing. Dust clung to everything. Roof shingles, pine bark, the rusted hinges of Harlan's tool shed. Even the flies seemed slower, heavy with the weight of whatever had settled over the ridge. The storm had passed, but it left behind a stillness that didn't feel like peace. Ruth stood at the edge of the tree line with her hands on her hips, eyes narrowed against the glare. The field was too quiet. Not even the chickadees were chattering, and that, more than anything, set her teeth on edge. Harlan stepped out from the cabin, wiping his hands on the thigh of his jeans. The porch creaked under his weight. He didn't say anything. He hadn't all morning. The mother was holding steady, breathing easier now, wounds wrapped tight with fresh yarrow and mullein. The child had slept through the night curled into her chest like a shadow stitched to skin, but neither of them had eaten. Not really. And the silence outside had grown too thick to ignore. They saw the truck before they heard it. It crept over the ridge like a beetle, dark gray, sun-bleached in patches, with antennas twitching from the cab like feelers. It made no sound until the tires touched gravel, and even then, the crunch was subdued, calculated. The vehicle stopped 30 yards from the cabin. Doors opened. 4 men stepped out. All clean boots, matching vests, canvas pants the color of dead grass. 2 carried clipboards. 1 had a long-range camera slung over his shoulder. The last wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast his eyes in shadow. Ruth felt her pulse tighten. Harlan didn't move, not even an inch. The lead man approached first, slow and friendly, like someone walking into a stranger's backyard with a plate of cookies. His badge was laminated, swinging loosely from his chest. The letters were too small to read from a distance, but the words he chose weren't. "Good morning," he said, voice pleasant, just the right amount of rasp. We're with the Northern Range Study Group, out of Cody, doing a census on mid-sized carnivores in this sector, wolverines mostly. Heard a few rumors of something bigger. Harlan didn't blink. Ruth stepped forward half a pace. Got permits? She asked. The man smiled, a politician's smile. All teeth, no soul. Sure do. You folks see anything unusual up here? We're tracking reports of deep-set prints, vocalizations, tree markings. That sound familiar? Ruth stared at him. His shirt was too clean. His boots didn't have mud from this valley, and the lanyard around his neck had a tear near the bottom that looked too deliberate, like someone had dragged it across gravel to make it look used. But the plastic sleeve was clear. No scratches. Too new. Harlan finally spoke, voice like dry stone. This is private land. The man nodded, slow and easy. We're not here to intrude, just checking leads. If you hear or see anything, we'd appreciate a heads up. Cooperation goes a long way. Behind him, the other men scanned the tree line. One squatted and picked up a pine cone. Another jotted notes in a book that looked blank from where Ruth stood. The last one stared directly at the cabin, his hand resting too comfortably near his belt. It didn't sit right. The man held out a business card. Ruth took it. The paper was heavy, textured, too polished for fieldwork. The number on the bottom looked printed over a faded logo. She didn't read it out loud. We'll circle back in a few days, he said, tipping his hat. Always good to keep an open line. They left slow, like they wanted to give the illusion of patience, like they weren't in any hurry. But the moment the truck vanished over the ridge, Ruth turned and marched straight inside. Harlan stayed out front, watching, listening, thinking. The card went straight into the wood stove. That night, neither of them slept. The cabin stayed dark, no fire, no lamps. Just the glow from the half-moon outside, cutting through the window slats like pale fingers. Harlan sat at the table, cleaning his old hammer, wiping down the handle until the grain showed raw. Ruth kept watch near the back window, rifle across her lap, boots laced tight. In the other room, the creatures slept again. The child curled into the mother's arms, both breathing slow, unaware of what had come. Just before dawn, Harlan rose and stepped out back. He moved slow, deliberate. The earth was soft with dew. No wind, just the sound of his breath and the whisper of trees. He circled the cabin, past the shed, then stopped dead. A length of twine had been stretched low between two stumps, almost invisible, caught just enough of the moonlight to glint. The line was taut, anchored, rigged to snap. His boot hovered inches from it. He stepped back, knelt, studied it. The knot was military, not something a random hunter would use. He followed the line with his fingers. It led into the underbrush, where a small spike had been hammered into a tree, sharpened at the tip. He reached for his knife, cut the twine clean. His hands didn't shake. By the time the sun cracked through the trees, the trap was gone. He didn't tell Ruth until later, didn't need to. She already knew. They spent the morning reinforcing the cabin doors, stacking wood not for warmth, but for blockade. Ruth rechecked the rifle's sight. Harlan moved like a man counting minutes. The woods stayed quiet that day. Too quiet. Like the birds knew what the people didn't. At dusk, Harlan stood at the tree line again. Same spot, same posture. The child had eaten a little that afternoon, berries and cooked oats. Its mother stirred but didn't rise. Her breath had steadied, but her eyes didn't open. The air smelled wrong, not like pine, like sweat and old leather. He scanned the distance. Nothing moved, but he felt them, out there, watching, waiting. This wasn't research. This wasn't wildlife tracking. This was something else, something colder. The sky burned orange as the sun dropped, and somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped under a boot that didn't belong to the forest. But the night said nothing. Not yet. Under a thin layer of morning frost, the land looked innocent again. Golden light cracked through bare aspens, casting long shadows across the hollow behind Harlan's cabin. The storm had blown itself out days ago, but its memory lingered. Wet earth, tangled branches, footprints half swallowed by time. The days had grown shorter, the air hung colder, and the feeling that time was running out had settled behind Harlan's ribs like a dull ache. He stood over the creek bed, eyes locked on the trail ahead. His hand clenched around the wooden frame of an old wheelbarrow. One wheel busted, its tray filled with folded tarp, canned food, a small water jug, and rope. Ruth emerged from the shed with an armful of flannel and fire-starting cloth. She moved like someone who'd done this before, but never under threat. Not like this. Inside the cabin, the mother was stirring more now. Still weak, but her eyes were clearer. She no longer slumped. Her breathing came stronger, deeper, like wind through canyon rock. The child never left her side, except when Harlan came close. Then it would rise, shuffle forward, place itself between them. Not aggressive, just there, watching. Like it had learned early that danger could wear any face. Even a kind one. They'd waited long enough. There was no more pretending that help would come or that silence would keep them safe. Tracks had been found just 30 feet from the back door. A partial cigarette, crushed under a boot sole. A red fiber snagged on the edge of the porch, not from any of their coats. The watchers weren't just waiting anymore. They were closing in. So they made a plan. Harlan would lead them out through the Torrey Creek ravine. Few dared cross that way. Too narrow, too uneven. No straight line to follow, only water, stone, and switchbacks thick with choke cherry. The place turned in on itself. Confused compasses. But that was the point. He knew it. Every hollow, every sudden drop. It was the last place those bastards would think to ambush. Ruth didn't ask how long the mother could walk. They both knew the answer didn't matter. At dusk, they dressed the scarecrow. Harlan pulled an old canvas shirt over the dummy's shoulders, stuffed the sleeves with pine straw and rope. A tattered hat. A pair of his boots weighted with river stones. They positioned it on the porch, slumped in the rocker. From a distance, it could pass for him. If someone was watching from behind a scope, waiting for movement, the illusion might buy them time. Maybe hours, maybe none. But it was better than waiting to be cornered. The mother stood on her own with help, limbs trembling but holding. Her eyes flicked to the trees with each step, scanning, remembering. The child clung to her leg as they moved, not with panic, but with quiet fear. It didn't understand the plan, not entirely, but it understood the danger. It had seen men. It had seen what they leave behind. They left just before moonrise. Ruth stayed behind at first. She'd lag and cover the tracks, scatter pine needles, pull branches back over the trail. If they were followed, she'd know. If they were caught. She didn't say it, but her eyes had. She'd make them work for it. The narrow path along Torrey Creek twisted like a wound. Water ran low this time of year, slicking the stone underfoot. The mother walked slow, one arm slung across Harlan's shoulder, the other cradling her side. The child padded barefoot beside her, stepping light as snowfall, sometimes slipping, sometimes catching itself with hands that had never held anything more dangerous than bark. The wind was rising, cold. Enough to bite skin, enough to whisper warnings in the ears of anyone still listening. Far behind, in a clearing no longer safe, a figure watched the porch light flicker. The hunting party wasn't far. The men had argued all morning. The leader wanted the mother alive, said she was worth something. To science, to buyers, to whoever would pay for proof. The younger one didn't see the point. He wanted action. Blood. He'd grown tired of waiting. The traps hadn't worked. The cameras were useless. The tracks they followed always went cold. He said they needed to move in, flush it out, end it. The leader reminded him who paid for the equipment. The younger man reminded him who knew how to use it. That night, the trees whispered more than usual. Every twig crack sounded like betrayal. The team fanned out near the north ridge. The leader kept the tranq gun. The younger man kept the kill shot. Somewhere between them, nerves started to fray. By the time Ruth reached the edge of the ravine, she could feel the storm behind her. Not of wind or water, of footsteps. She crouched low, laid her hand flat against the dirt. Still warm. Someone was coming, fast, too fast for a patrol, too angry for a ranger. She slipped behind the ridge, tucked the flashlight into her pack, and started after Harlan. She didn't run. She knew better. You don't run when you're being followed. You walk like you belong. Up ahead, the trail narrowed into a choke point. The mother stumbled. Harlan caught her. She wheezed, lips pulled back in silent pain. The child tugged at her arm, whining low. He glanced up, caught sight of the slope ahead, and froze. Ruth was supposed to be here by now, but there was no movement, no signal. Only branches bending low under the night wind and the faint sound of something unnatural. A zipper. Metal. Breathing. He moved quickly, helped her to a hollow under the overhang, waved the child to crouch low. Then he turned back, ducked behind a thick pine, heart pounding in time with the rising rustle of boots on wet earth. Voices. Close. 2 men. The leader spoke low, calm, the other one louder, angrier. They were arguing again. About method, about the girl, about the cost. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was they were close enough to smell. And then Ruth stepped into view. She wasn't supposed to, but she had to. They spotted her before they realized what she was doing. She raised her arms. "Back off," she said. "You're not hunting deer." The younger man stepped forward. "You're trespassing." She didn't blink. "You're lying." They didn't speak. And then something shifted in the trees behind her. The child had darted out before Harlan could stop it. It raced to its mother, stumbling slightly, hands outstretched. The men raised their weapons. Harlan broke cover, shouting, arms wide, body in full view. And then, from the mouth of the hollow, the mother stood. Not straight, not tall, but enough. Enough to see her full size, her weight, her presence. She didn't scream, didn't charge. She stepped forward, placing herself between the guns and her child. Her arms opened. Not in attack, but in protection, like a wall of breath and fur and blood and history. The men froze. The younger one's finger tightened on the trigger. The leader stepped forward, eyes wide, not in fear, but in awe. He'd never seen her like this. Not in photos, not in traps, not like this. Alive, unbroken. The younger man swore under his breath. "Take the shot." The leader lowered his gun. "You do it." Silence. And then, for one terrible second, everything held still. Then the mother took one more step forward, and the forest, somehow, grew quieter still. The rain came down in curtains, heavy and hard like 1,000 fists on the back of a barn roof. It had started mid-afternoon, a slow drizzle that soaked through collarbones and cuffs, and by nightfall it had become something else entirely. Flood rain, mountain rain, the kind that came howling from the west with teeth and didn't care what it took down with it. The sky split open in flashes, throwing crooked light across the ridge. Water ran like veins through the gullies. Even the trees leaned sideways, groaning as the wind shoved them awake. They were deep into the ravine now, near the switchback above the third bend where the creek spilled sudden and violent over black stone. Ruth's boots slipped once on the moss-slicked trail, and Harlan caught her by the elbow before she went down. The mother trudged a few paces ahead, her body soaked, movement slower now. But she hadn't fallen. Not yet. The child stayed close, keeping to her side like a second shadow, arms wrapped around itself, blinking against the sting of cold. Up above them, higher up the slope where the scrub grew thick and the footing turned loose, the hunters scrambled to keep sight. Their radios were useless now. The signals were lost in the gorge, drowned in water and static. The younger man cursed again, loud this time, over the roar of the flood below. "Damn trail's gone." "They didn't take the trail," the older one snapped back, face slick with rain, jacket collar pulled high. They cut through the rock bed. They're trying to lose us." "No," the younger one growled, voice tight. "They're trying to get somewhere." He was right, but he didn't know how right. Harlan had chosen this route for a reason. There was a deadfall ahead, an old logging path from decades back, now collapsed and overrun. But more than that, there was a way out. A place the old-timers used to say belonged to the fog and nothing else. It was risky, but every step closer meant one step further from the cabin. From the front porch where they'd left nothing behind but a limp scarecrow and a cold stove. The rain kept pushing, filling the creek, choking the banks. What had been shallow trickles yesterday were now rushing walls of mud-gray water, thick with branches and stones. The roar was everywhere now. In the trees, in the lungs, in the chest. That's when the scream came. It wasn't from the group. It wasn't from the child. It came from above. A sound that didn't belong to the forest. The younger man had slipped. Too eager, too fast. His foot went out from under him on the edge of the path, and he tumbled hard, crashing through brush, arms pinwheeling. He hit the slope sideways, slid down slick clay, and was swallowed whole by the flood below. Gone in seconds. His partner shouted something, maybe his name, maybe nothing at all, and bolted downhill, sliding fast behind him, half-controlled. The creek below surged again, and then something impossible happened. From the edge of the lower bank, where the water cut hard into stone, a shape moved. Massive, dark, soaked. The mother stepped into the current. Not a scream, not a sound. She plunged waist-deep, arms stretched wide. The water tore at her, pulled, snapped around her like wolves. But she reached him, that boy who had aimed a gun at her child. She reached into the flood, wrapped her arms around him, and pulled. Dragged him back to shore like a log from a river. His eyes were wide, terrified. Not of her, of death. He coughed hard, gasped, stared at her as she let go and stepped back, her body shaking from the effort. She didn't run. She didn't threaten. She turned away and walked back toward the trees. The older man reached him moments later, slipped in the mud beside him, helped him up. The younger one just kept staring after her, like he couldn't make sense of anything anymore. He whispered something then, not to his partner, to himself. "She saved me." His gun dropped into the water. He didn't reach for it, didn't even notice. Behind them, the others caught up. One pointed a rifle. The young man stood up, got between them, said one word, "No." "What the hell are you doing?" someone barked. He turned slowly. "She pulled me out." "She what?" "She didn't have to. She could have let me drown." Silence broke the group into fragments. Eyes moved from one face to the next. No one spoke. Harlan watched it all from the edge of the ridge, crouched behind a fallen log, breath shallow, heart pounding like a drum. Ruth was beside him, hands on the flare kit she'd carried since her days in the tower. He touched her arm. She didn't ask. She lit the flare. The red glow cracked open the dark like a wound. It hissed into the sky, streaking fire above the trees, bathing the whole ravine in crimson. It was a call. An old one every ranger knew. Distress. Not from nature, from people. Within seconds, the sound of engines echoed back across the valley. From the eastern rim, headlights cut through the trees. Local rangers. Volunteers. Locals with radios and rifles and nerves. Men who knew the sound of a warning when they heard it. The hunting group scattered. One ran east. Two west. The man who'd been saved didn't move. He stood in the middle of the water, staring into the trees where the mother had disappeared. The storm cracked again. Lightning turned the forest white. Then it all went dark again. By the time the rangers reached them, there was no resistance. Just a soaked notebook. Coordinates. Diagrams. Plans. Traps. Every word an admission. The wind began to ease. Branches stopped thrashing. And far off, deeper into the mountain, the sound of something heavy moving through brush grew fainter. Not gone, but leaving. That night, as the rain softened to drizzle, Harlan stood near the edge of the creek, clothes plastered to his skin. He looked across the rocks and mud. Nothing but broken branches, crushed grass, and a silence that didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like thanks. The snow had started the night before. Not heavy, just soft flakes drifting down like dust shaken from the sleeves of winter. By morning, the ground was quilted in a thin coat of white, barely an inch deep, but enough to hush the forest, enough to bury the last signs of what had happened in that ravine. The flood was gone. The creek had shrunk back into its bed, calmer now, colder. The air carried a strange calm with it, a quiet not born of peace, but of distance, as if something sacred had passed through and the trees were still bowing in its wake. Harlan stood near the edge of a narrow trail that branched off from the main logging road. It wasn't on any map. Most folks didn't even know it existed. A deer path at best, hemmed in by bare aspen on one side and a steep drop on the other. The snow made everything look gentler than it really was. Ruth adjusted the straps of the canvas pack across her shoulders, then helped tighten the sling of cloth they'd fashioned for the mother's weakened leg. The wound was healing. Not fast, not clean, but enough. Enough to move. Enough to leave. The mother towered above them, still hunched but upright, one hand resting on the child's shoulder, the other gripping the branch Harlan had carved into a crutch. Her breath steamed in the cold, long and steady, her fur dusted in white. The child pressed close to her side, silent, watching every move, every sound. It hadn't let go of her once since the river, not even when the men with flashlights and radios had stormed the ridge, shouting over the wind, pointing and panicking as the flood swept away their plan. That night had changed something. Maybe in all of them. No one had come looking since. Not the rangers, not the hunters, not the scientists with their shiny boots and plastic tags. The story had unraveled into fog, like the woods had swallowed it whole. And now it was time to take them where no roads led, where no fences stretched, where silence still meant safety. They followed the ridge south, past where the granite slabs peeled open like broken teeth, down into a basin no one had touched since the old logging days. Ruth led at first, eyes scanning the snow for signs of disturbance. Coyote prints, scat, anything that might spell trouble. Harlan stayed close behind the mother, always just within reach, but never pushing her pace. He could hear the wheeze in her chest when the trail pitched upward, could see the way her left foot dragged just slightly with each step. But she didn't stop. She didn't complain. She just kept moving forward. They came to the old fire watch line by late morning. A patch of pines had been cleared decades ago to make space for a power line that never got built. Now it was a ghost trail. Nothing but stumps and saplings and the odd rusted nails sticking out from a rotted stake. From there, the trail curved west, descending into a hollow so quiet even the birds hadn't followed. Harlan paused there. Ruth turned to him. "This the spot?" she asked. He didn't answer at first, just looked around. Then he nodded. They set down the packs, took a long breath, and waited. The mother stepped forward on her own, past the edge of the pines, into a clearing where the snow had melted slightly. Steam rising from dark earth warmed by underground springs. She looked up, closed her eyes, then kept walking. The child followed. No hesitation, no sound. They crossed the hollow like shadows, moving toward a ridge on the other side thick with fir. The trees swallowed them slowly, like water soaking into sand. No sudden goodbyes, no grand farewell, just the natural pulling away of one world from another. Ruth stood with her hands in her coat pockets, shoulders stiff, face unreadable. Her breath hung in the air like smoke. She didn't say anything. Neither did Harlan. They just watched. Then, halfway across the basin, the child stopped, turned, looked back. Its eyes locked on Harlan. It didn't wave, didn't cry, just held that gaze, longer than needed. Long enough to say thank you without speaking. Long enough for Harlan to feel something shift behind his ribs. Some old weight he'd carried for years unstitching itself without warning. The mother touched the child's shoulder, and then they were gone. The woods closed behind them. Not with drama, not with sound, just with stillness. Ruth didn't move. She just stood there, eyes fixed on the place where they'd vanished. Harlan stepped up beside her, took off his cap, ran a hand through his damp hair. "That's it then," he said. She didn't answer. She just reached out, took his hand, held it, and for a while neither of them spoke. They stood in the middle of nowhere, in the first snow of winter, hand in hand, both of them listening to the quiet. And for once, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like breathing again. On the way back, they didn't speak much. The trail wound slower on the return. Or maybe time just moved differently when you weren't guarding something sacred. The sun had dipped low behind the ridge, casting the snow in long shadows that danced between trees like old spirits. At one bend, Ruth paused and looked back. The path behind them was already being covered, falling flakes erasing prints before they could freeze in place. Nature remembering how to forget. Back at the cabin, the firewood pile was still high. The rocker still creaked in the wind. The air smelled of pine sap and old stories. But something had changed. The quiet wasn't the same. That night, they sat on the porch. Didn't need the stove. Just wrapped in blankets, boots propped up, a mug of coffee between them. The stars were out. Thick and low, bright like they only get in the mountains when the moon stays gone. Harlan leaned back, eyes half closed. "You think they'll be all right?" Ruth didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I think they already were. We're the ones still figuring it out." He smiled, just barely, and let the silence carry the rest. The ice let go sometime in March. Not with a bang, not all at once. Just quietly, over a string of warm days when the sun stayed out a little longer, and the creek behind the cabin found its voice again. First, it was just a trickle. Then a song. Then a current strong enough to carry off the branches that had piled up over winter. The pines, still dark from melt, stood taller against the sky. Moss returned to the north face of stone. Little green shoots pushed through frozen soil as if they'd been waiting all year to speak. Everything was soft again, and alive, and watching. Ruth wiped her brow with the edge of her sleeve, a streak of mud painting her temple. She'd been pulling snare wire for most of the morning, finding them buried deep along the southern tree line. Some rusted, some fresh enough to shine, each one a reminder of how close things had come. She snapped the last one free with a twist of her pliers and dropped it in the bucket with the others. It clinked against the metal like a warning long past due. She stood, back sore, knees stiff, but satisfied. On the porch, Harlan worked on a sign. He'd found an old cedar plank behind the shed, sanded it down, cleaned it with care like he used to do back in the days when he carved gifts instead of graves. Now he etched into it with the point of a nail, slow and steady. The message wasn't for tourists or hikers. It wasn't for scientists or men with tags and lies. It was for anyone still human enough to hear what wasn't said. No words, just the outline of a hand, not a human hand, wider, wiser. Beneath it, 3 lines carved like claw marks. A warning, a prayer, a memory. He nailed it to the edge of the old footbridge, where the creek bent low and the trees leaned close, as if listening. The sign faced the woods, not the road. In the weeks since that last snow, the world had gone on pretending nothing happened. Newspapers in town talked about late-season storms, the impact on ranchers, the threat of another drought. No one mentioned the flare. No one asked about the group of men who'd left a truck in the woods and never came back to claim it. A ranger from Jackson came sniffing around once, asking polite questions. Ruth gave polite answers. He didn't come back. They knew how stories disappeared out here. The woods didn't hold on to noise. They remembered the right things. The cabin looked different now. Not on the outside, still patched with mismatched boards. The same crooked stovepipe, the same threadbare rocking chair by the door. But inside, something had shifted. The air didn't feel so still. Harlan had cleared a spot near the back, laid out a cot, not for sleeping but for sitting, thinking. Sometimes Ruth would catch him there, carving without plan, just letting his hands move. Shapes would come out. Strange ones. Not animals, not people. Something between. Something old. He didn't explain. She didn't ask. One morning, Ruth brought over a pot of coffee. The kind that boiled over if you didn't watch it. The kind her husband used to love. They sat on the porch as the sun climbed, steam curling from their mugs. The snow was gone now, except for a few patches hiding in the shade. Birds had returned. Jays and wrens. One brave squirrel darted across the clearing like it owned the place. Harlan watched it, his face unreadable. "They remember," he said, voice low, not looking at her. She didn't answer. He sipped his coffee. "I don't mean them," he added, quieter. Ruth just nodded. They spent the rest of the day walking the southern ridge, pulling old nails from trunks, clearing the last of the trail cams someone had left behind. Ruth found a plastic case, buried in brush. Inside, batteries corroded. Lens cracked. The card still intact. She didn't open it. Just tossed it into the fire that night, the plastic curling like something alive before collapsing in on itself. That spring passed slow. No sightings. No tracks. No sounds that didn't belong. But they never said goodbye. It didn't feel like an ending. Just a shift. The mother and child had faded back into the world that made them. The forest had folded shut behind them. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind passed low over the hills and the trees swayed in that slow rhythm of breathing, something moved at the edge of hearing. Not a footstep, not quite. Just the kind of silence that follows something sacred. Harlan heard it first, then Ruth. Neither said anything. They didn't have to. That summer they built a second shed, smaller, half hidden behind the trees. Stocked it with dried berries, cloth bandages, salt. A red scarf was hung from a nail above the door. No explanation. Just there, at the base of the trail, near the old stone marker where Harlan's dog used to chase squirrels, they planted wildflowers. Not in rows, just scattered. Let them grow how they wanted. Ruth brought down a Bible one morning and left it open on the porch, weighted by a smooth stone. She never quoted it out loud again, but her fingers found the same page often. The page about mercy. By fall, the air grew thin again. The light turned amber. Nights came quicker. Harlan chopped wood with the same rhythm he always had, but this time he stacked extra. Just in case. Ruth stayed longer, cooked more. Sometimes she brought over stories from town, how the Caldwells were moving out, how the general store was closing early on Sundays, how no one really talked about the men who went missing. But once she said something else. "I think people know," she said, "even if they don't say it." Harlan didn't look up from his work. "Know what?" She hesitated. "That the woods gave something back, that something was protected." He nodded, once, then kept stacking. One morning, well into the first frost of October, Harlan stepped out early. The grass crunched beneath his boots. His breath clouded ahead of him. He stood at the edge of the field, where the creek curved sharp near the boulders, and waited. Not for anything in particular, just listening. The sun was coming up slow, a pale gold smudge through the mist, and in that mist, just for a moment, he heard it. A sound he hadn't heard in months. A step. Not a man's, not a bear's. Something larger, wider. He didn't turn, didn't move, just let it pass through him. He looked up. The ridge shimmered in light, and somewhere, far off, the sound faded. Not a farewell. Not quite. Just a reminder that what's wild doesn't always stay gone, and some silences aren't empty. They're kept. Sometimes the quietest stories leave the loudest echoes. Not the ones filled with noise and spectacle, but the ones made of glances held too long, of hands outstretched in silence, of choices made in the still of the woods when no one else is watching. These are the stories that remind us. There is a kind of strength in gentleness, a kind of truth in things that go unspoken. There are bonds that form beyond words, beyond species, even beyond understanding. A look across the divide can carry more than 1,000 explanations. A single act of mercy can cut through years of pain. And sometimes, healing doesn't come all at once. It arrives slowly, through seasons, through small rituals, through the simple, sacred act of choosing not to harm what we fear. The wilderness teaches in its own language. It doesn't demand that we understand everything, only that we respect what we do not, that we walk softer, that we look twice before turning away, and that sometimes the most profound connection is not built through possession or study, but through shared silence, through the act of witnessing and choosing to protect instead of control. Maybe there are things in this world we're not meant to explain. Maybe mystery isn't a problem to solve, but a gift to carry, a responsibility, a reminder that not everything belongs in a cage or on a screen. Some truths live better in the hush between heartbeat and breath, in the memory of a footprint quickly covered by snow, or the sense that you're being watched kindly in the woods, and not alone. And if you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for listening. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear what stayed with you most. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. And if you believe there's still room in this world for quiet stories about compassion, mystery, and what it means to protect something without needing to possess it, consider subscribing and following the channel. We've got more to share. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and remember, not all who vanish are lost. Some are simply going home.